Today, I would like to start by talking about something that happened 50 years ago, actually. 50 years, 2 months, and 3 weeks ago, exactly, in the Hilton Hotel in Boston, Massachusetts. An MIT professor of mechanical engineering, his name was Steve Kunz, was addressing an audience of architects, designers, and artists assembled for the National Art Education Association. What he did was remarkable. He outlined a vision for the future of computational design, and more generally speaking, for the future of creative practices. This vision and this aspiration we may find remarkably familiar today. So he said, artists, architects, and scientists alike perform creative acts. He said, it is our pleasure to be imaginative, intuitive, unpredictable, and human. He continued, it is our agony that in the creation of our work, we are forced to do many things that are non-creative, that are drudgery, that are decidedly uninteresting, and that should be done by some kind of slave. Now, in 1966, an appropriate kind of slave exists. It is the computer. So today I would like to reflect on this narrative of the computer as a perfect slave, as an enabler of creativity, as I think it encapsulates what I like to call a theory of design that evolved during the second half of the 20th century. This theory related humans, machines, and the social and material practices of design in a novel and interesting way. For those of us who are concerned with the developing a critical and reflective role on the role that technologies play in the production of the built environment, it is a worthy subject of analysis and debate. It should also sound remarkably current, as popular images of design portray technologies, robot arms, agent-based simulations, smart cities, wearable computers, machine learning, responsive environments, 3D printers, 3D printing 3D printers as perfect slaves of designers, as obedient grooms taking care of the drudgery of working with physical materials or of performing complex calculations, enabling a sort of pastoral life of creativity and sophistication. Last week, for example, some of us had the opportunity of watching this robot, or a robot very similar to this one, perform a DJ set for us, even as the team in charge of carefully staging the demo did not manage to get their own microphone to work. So imagined paradoxically as both submissive to and autonomous from humans, stories about machine agency often place technologies in isolation from social actors and institutions, independent from the contingencies of the local, the material, and the affective. So my talk today will try to show that there is much to gain by complicating this view, which has remained remarkably unaltered in popular narratives about technology and creativity since Professor Steve Kunz, its earliest advocate, articulated it 50 years ago in the Hilton. Thus, in contrast with most efforts to engage with the digital technologies we use in architecture and design today, I try to avoid perspectives that emphasize, for example, the aesthetic novelty enabled by 3D software and numerically controlled devices, the artistic prowess of usually white male architects such as Greg Lüne, Peter Eisenman, or Frank Gehry, or the promises of managerial control advanced by software entrepreneurs. Instead, I am interested in computer technologies and the discourses about design that they have elicited as artifacts indigenous to the cultural politics of the Cold War, to the Anglo-Saxon university, and to, more generally speaking, a contemporary globalist mindset. This resembles, in some ways, what Paul Edwards has called a counter-history, an attempt to escape a discipline's internal accounts that overwhelmingly in architecture frame digital technologies either as inevitable saviors or as negligible contraptions, either as inexorable waves or as dematerialized ethereal tools, either as phantasmal forces driving cultural and historical change, or as neutral vessels of design intent. More specifically, I'm interested in illuminating those who have devised, promoted, and explored software systems for design, particularly in architecture, erecting cultural and technical systems with an important role shaping our artificial environments today. It is to members of this group of technologists, mathematicians, architects, academics, engineers, theorists, proselytizers, and evangelists whom I invoke with the phrase builders of the vision, which is also the title of the book. To illuminate them, we have to look outside the worlds of architects and artists and designers, and in fact peek into the rapidly changing landscape of technological research taking place during the second half of the 20th century, especially in the US and in Europe. The issue in question, as Lyotard would say, is that optic pens, radar screens, military research contracts, disciplinary tensions within research universities, punched cards, cathode ray tube displays, servo motors, aircraft and car manufacturing and political doctrines, the travel of ideas, equations, and people across continental and institutional boundaries, geometric algorithms, and numerically controlled milling machines are not passive spectators, but rather engaged actors in a rich web that has also redefined and continues to redefine what it means to design, to build, and to be creative. This web constitutes a new condition that I would like to think of as infrastructural, a condition that those of us interested in the relationship between creative practices and technological systems have yet to fully visualize and confront. Another way of saying this is that software and numerically controlled devices today resemble more telegraph lines or railroads than what they resemble tools like drafting tables or pens. They're no longer tools. They're better imagined as infrastructures enabled by global information networks and increasingly sophisticated algorithms. These systems are infrastructural in the way they shape the way we practice design and imagine the built environment. This is something that John Walker, the CEO of Autodesk, the US company developing AutoCAD and Revit, two of the most important modeling packages for architects and engineers, understood really well. He didn't use the word infrastructure, but even in the 1980s, this statement, never underestimate the power of a widely distributed tool, seems somewhat Foucauldian. What this statement seems to suggest is that we may yet have to grapple with the infrastructural scale of design technologies. Granted, Walker was probably referring to the power of these tools to make him extremely rich, but that is probably besides the point. The point is that if we are to recognize the new forms of work, the new forms of craftsmanship, the new forms of social organizations that go with these technologies, a shift of perspective is in order. If the cluster of disciplines concerned with the study of media, science, and technology have examined the social and material histories of different technologies, such as typewriters and thermometers, hard disks, and nuclear reactors, complicating discourses of neutrality and objectivity, we may also look at the systems we use as media to imagine, to simulate, to coordinate, and build our artificial environment. This is a habit of mind that I hope I can convey today, and that is the main subject of the book. To examine technological discourses about design and put them in contrast with what we may call, with Keller Easterling, technologies observed dispositions. Of course, a tradition of media studies usefully focuses on the ways material conditions of technologies shape discursive practices. My approach, however, to these questions has been mostly shaped by the interdisciplinary field of science and technology studies, which has helped account for the local, the material, and the affective in technology in ways that decenter the human agency and reveal, as Lucy Suchman writes, the provincial contingencies and uncertainties of their own futures, as well as the situated practices required to reproduce that centrality. From this perspective, what may look in technological discourses as inevitable and seamless futures are restored to the multiple social and material arrangements, interests, contexts that make it possible. So we may see how the unusual shapes in some of the contemporary architectures have more to do, not only formally, but also technically, historically, and conceptually, with fighter jets, helicopter wings, and ship hulls, than with what is often construed inside the discipline as an autonomous stylistic evolution. This view is an illustration of what I like to call our technological imagination of design, which is a rhetorical device that highlights the strong, irreducible interdependence between our shaping of the built world and the landscape of media and cultural technologies we have developed since the post-war. Software, hardware, numerically controlled machinery, but also symbolic and procedural frameworks for design exploration, manufacturing, and management. So I will now go back to the Cold War era and try to sketch what amounts to a continuity that I identify in chapters 4 and 5 of the book that looks at the group of engineers and mathematicians that were sponsored by the US Air Force and who first formulated, I claim, a computer theory of design. Origin stories of computer-aided design inevitably point at this system, the sketchpad system, as the first example of interactive computer graphics. Presented as part of the PhD of Ivan Sutherland in 1964 at MIT, Sketchpad was in fact a transformative achievement, featuring many of the functions we see today in CAD interfaces, such as rubber banding, parametric flexibility, and object instantiation. And yet, Sketchpad did not just emerge from a void. It didn't emerge either from the desire to automate drafting, as it is often understood. Computational ideas about part design and manufacturing had been circulating at MIT laboratories since at least the 1940s, specifically around efforts to create the first numerically controlled milling machines. By 1952, these efforts had already resulted in the successful demonstration of a milling machine driven by paper tape. This effort was the result of a collaboration between John Parsons, who was the vice president of an aircraft manufacturing company based in Michigan, and a laboratory at MIT called Servomechanisms Laboratory, which had developed important innovations in terms of anti-aircraft servomechanisms, artillery. So it was actually Parsons and not the MIT engineers who had the idea of driving a machine using punched cards. And Parsons actually sought the MIT engineers as subcontractors for developing this system. He had already secured funding from the US Air Force to develop a proof of concept device. However, as David Noble also observes, the MIT engineers gradually displaced Parsons' authority and took over the project. But that's a story for another day. What is important for our questions today is that engineers and technologists that are virtually unknown to designers such as Gordon Brown, William Pease, and crucially Douglas Ross, devised languages and theories for the representation and manipulation of information for manufacturing. By drawing together information about geometry, materials, and machines in the new symbolic space of software, these researchers formulated the foundations of a computer theory of design. Their motivation was to automate the process of producing the paper tape to drive the machine. By the mid-1950s, it was already very clear to these engineers that the process of creating punched paper tape to drive the machine was extremely cumbersome. Even for very simple parts, a number of engineers had to work for several hours in order to calculate, for instance, the speed of the motors, the most efficient tool path, and this called the efficiency of automated manufacturing into question. It was an extremely slow and time-intensive process. So the Servolab engineers started to explore ways for computers to automate other parts of the process, in particular, the production of the paper tape. And they understood that to be the design stage. So by using the computer to automate the calculation of the machine toolpath, they wanted to get rid of blueprints altogether. This image shows you how they imagined the workflow of design to manufacturing would evolve with the adoption of numerically controlled technologies. What I think is very interesting about this image is that actually the earliest version of the workflow seems simpler than the one that is portrayed as the more advanced. There's more people and more technologies involved. We'll get back to that in a couple of slides. So what is interesting also is that the servo-lab engineers were not actually designers. They were mathematicians, and they were electrical engineers. They were concerned mostly with the development of programming languages for manufacturing and with the production of symbolic systems to mediate between the milling machine and the new symbolic space of software. So they invited a new group of people to participate in the design or in the ideation of computer-aided design. The expanded team comprised the original servo-lab members led by Douglas Ross, a very important character, and a team of designers from the design and graphics division who was at the time adscribed at the mechanical engineering department at MIT, and which was led by Steve Kunz, the professor who I started talking about today. It also included names that would become important for the history of computer graphics, such as D.M. Bauman, Timothy Johnson, and Larry Roberts. Between 1959 and 1970, the computer-aided design project, and this was the name that they adopted, was funded by 3 successive contracts with the Air Force. It was jointly led by Douglas Ross, who is sitting in this picture, and Professor Kunz, who's standing up. And the project's goal was clearly stated in all of the reports. It was to improve manufacturing for military purposes and, all capitals, more Air Force per dollar. That was sort of the idea behind these technologies. That was the reason the US government was invested in them. But crucially, the CAD project was also at the roots of a very interesting, very rich history of post-war sponsored research at MIT that resulted in the foundation in 1975 of the MIT Laboratory of Computer Science, the precursor to the famous CCEL, and later, as we will see, of the MIT Media Lab. And these are some images of the earliest toolpaths in 3D, produced with the Whirlwind computer, and some of the early reports. But this history, this linear, this evolution of these research projects into what today is seen as a global center of technological prowess at MIT is nicely illustrated by this image, which shows how the CAD project was at the roots of an expanding project called Project MECS, which was an acronym for both machine augmented cognition and multi-access computer. So it was a project to harness the opportunities for computing of time sharing, so the earliest network computers, but also informed by ideas, by emergent ideas about artificial intelligence and the way these systems would transform different research and manufacturing practices. So the CAD project was at the root of this project, which, as I mentioned, is crucial to the establishment of MIT as a sort of the future of everywhere, to cite Lucy Sochman. So this Project MECS was this cross-disciplinary, extremely ambitious research endeavor that also combined different disciplinary sensibilities, different philosophies of research, different professional groups, and, as we will see, defined the first theories of computer-aided design. The earliest theorization of computer-aided design framed design as a kind of language processing. The idea was that design could be encoded as a procedure, and that this procedure could be performed automatically as long as each of the elements and the relationships between these elements were properly encoded symbolically in computer code. This is explained by the influence of servo-lab engineers like Douglas Ross, who really dominated the early stages of this project. They were bringing with them a concern with language design from the development of programming languages such as ALGOL and APT. For them, the main issue was not how to solve the problems, but rather how to state them. At the same time, a different idea emerged, portraying design as a collaborative process, a cybernetic performance involving a human and a machine working in an iterative feedback loop comprising a creative stage in which a design representation is created and a mechanical stage in which the representation is tested against different metrics such as mechanical stress and overall structural performance. So, to use our friend Steve Kunz's own words, a CAD system is to join man and machine, because it was always a man, in an intimate cooperative complex, a combination that would use the creative and imaginative powers of the man and the analytical and computational powers of the machine, each with the greatest possible economy and efficiency. So, before we move to the next, the CAD project really confronted these two different sensibilities towards design. And these sensibilities play out as a result of different disciplinary trainings, different projects, different lineages of research at the institute at the time. On the one hand, the mathematically inclined servo-lab members who were inclined to see themselves as scientists, and experienced designers from the design and graphics division whose teaching and research were practice and project oriented. So different from Douglas Ross and the other members of the servo-lab group, Kunz and Mann and Timothy Johnson, they were coming more from the world of engineering and manufacturing. Kunz had spent more than a decade in the aircraft industry developing mathematical methods for building doubly curved shapes. So they were very much involved in the actual production of airplane parts and also with car manufacturing. So in the servo-lab's worldview, the symbolic worldview, which is exemplified by the highly abstract and language-oriented approach that we have discussed, design was understood more as a noun, a geometric specification that could be calculated and in fact manufactured if the design problem was properly represented in a formal language. In contrast, for the experienced designers from the design and graphics division, design was more of a verb, an open-ended and fundamentally human activity. The phrase computer-aided design, in fact, reflects this distinction, because it's not computer-automated design or computer-augmented design, it's computer-aided design, suggesting that the computer is to play a supportive role of human designers. What is interesting here is that cybernetic ideas are used as theoretical justification for human agency in design. Theorizing design cybernetically as a human-machine interaction feedback loop helped Kunz and his team convey and reassert the value of their professional expertise against a worldview that focused mostly on automation and symbolic inscription. This debate over the relationship between design and automation also described a disciplinary conflict. As we saw, during the 1940s and 50s, the servo-lab had successfully automated the work of milling machine operators, displacing work from the machine shop to a programmer's desk. Now, in the early 1960s, they sought to produce a similar shift in the drafting room, automating the work of the design engineer. So for Kunz, Johnson, Mann, Baumann, and the other designers involved in the CAD project, asserting the complex nature of human decision-making was also a way of affirming the social roles and the professional identities they had as designers, resisting what to them felt as an imperialist impulse to encode their work in the symbolic language of software. The tension between this impulse and the designer's ethos is visible across the archival materials of the project, as well as in the accounts of some of its survivors. For example, in a series of notes written shortly after one of the early CAD meetings, Kunz uses music as an example to consider the boundaries of creative practice. This is perhaps one of the first cases for human authorship in the digital age. In these spirited notes, authorship over a piece of music, let's say Prokofiev, which is the example Kunz gives, remains with Prokofiev, even when a computer is automatically generating a new piece in his style. So, Kunz defines creativity as a distinctly human attribute consisting of reflective operations imagined to be outside the capacity of computers. What is interesting here is that in the project to imagine computer-aided design, negotiations over what could or should be automated had a political and social dimension within which the contours of a new conception of creativity were drawn. And this debate is also a snapshot of a larger question, a larger shift that was taking place in the United States higher education. It was a move from wartime case-based, project-based, messy forms of research, very close to the production of the actual engineering artifacts for the war, towards assigning a greater value to forms of knowledge that could be symbolically encoded. So knowledge that could be verbalized, mathematically inscribed, and computed with had a sort of greater epistemological status than practices such as design that are so much based in the processes of making and doing that have been traditional to design education. So in contrast with other disciplines like mathematics and electrical engineering and, of course, later computer science, these activities of drawing and making did not lend themselves easily to codices, to universal postulates or stable theories. The messy and applied practices of design and architecture appear to be far from the new order and from MIT's very core. So at stake in this debate was no less than the place of design and of tacit and embodied forms of knowledge production within the university. So, crucially, this the theory of design that emerged from the production of these technological systems and from these theoretical debates between engineers and designers and mathematicians can be distilled into three theoretical reconfigurations. On the one hand, what I like to call a new tectonics of design representation, that founded on the recognition that the computational image is fundamentally different from pictorial images drawn on paper with ink, right? Because it has a numerical structure. It has a computable, symbolic structure that we can play with, that we can use as index for other attributes, and therefore, the computer image is to be imagined as a sort of engineered artifact. It's a structured artifact. The second reconfiguration is a human-machine division of labor. As we saw, Kunz was very clear about this sort of outlining the boundaries of automation around what the mechanical powers of the machine and the creative powers of the human. So there's a sense that there's a subdivision of labor, a cybernetic feedback loop that takes advantage of the best qualities of both humans and machines. And the third one is a humanization of the computer, which is linked to the previous one, where the computer starts to be represented, portrayed, endowed with human attributes such as obedience or playfulness or ethics, etc. So these engineers, what is interesting here to realize is that these engineers were not simply solving a predefined problem. They were not just designing a system to accomplish certain goals, to build more airplanes, etc. They were also sort of reorganizing ideas about design around the capacities of the computer. In that sense, we can think of them as design theorists and philosophers who sought to reimagine design as a computational process. In particular, Steve Kunz's contributions to CAD are massive and his life intriguing. He never obtained an academic degree. He was a self-taught mathematician and designer, His contributions to the world of computer graphics are well recognized, in particular the Kunz patch, which is, he basically invented the first mathematical method for interpolating a doubly curved surfaces, taking a starting point, a series of curved segments, which was called the Kunz patch, and was very useful to early aircraft design, and also was very successful in bringing the attention of a lot of young researchers into the field of computer graphics. That contribution of Kunz is well recognized. What is not well recognized yet is his role as this, as a theoretician of design, as someone who was able to envision how design processes could be or should be through the computer. Kunz was never offered tenure at MIT, and he left in 1969 for a full professorship at the University of Syracuse in the US. This was difficult to understand for his students. A truly distinguished list of people who went on to become pioneers in different areas of computation, including Nicholas Negroponte, Ivan Sutherland, Robin Forrest, Tim Johnson, and Larry Roberts. Some of them saw him as a father. When I asked Tim Johnson about this, he said, Kunz turned me on. He turned Ivan Sutherland on, and he was worth several full professors. Nicholas Negroponte and other former students I have interviewed have expressed similar thoughts. Some of his students are here in Europe, some of them in Hungary, some of them in the UK. And while he was never offered tenure at MIT, he continued to have academic positions in universities such as Colorado, Utah, Michigan, and Harvard, and died in Boulder in 1979 at the age of 67. So the CAT project researchers were the first to systematically explore and theorize design as a human-machine endeavor. They were also, I like to call them public intellectuals. This is the American version of a public intellectual, the engineer who's promoting a particular view, cultural perspective on the practices they are engaging with as technicians, and that have shaped the contemporary imagination and practices of design. I'll take a few seconds to drink a little bit of water. And let's briefly focus on an illustration of how this theory of design traveled across disciplinary boundaries to the field of architecture, as an architect adopted and adapted these discourses and technologies to imagine experimental scenarios involving architecture, the environment, and the city. Nicholas Negroponte needs little introduction. He is well known for his work as a chairman of the One Laptop Per Child Foundation, for his best-selling books, especially Being Digital, and for his work as chairman emeritus of the MIT Media Lab. What is less known is that his career as an academic, technological entrepreneur, and cultural entrepreneur, perhaps, and futurist, evolved from a different, if connected, set of concerns linked to the early days of computer-aided design and to Steve Kunz. Steve and Nicholas Negroponte met in the spring of 1962 in one of the architectural geometry courses Kunz had developed for the Department of Architecture at MIT. A few years later, in the spring of 1966, Negroponte attended another of Kunz's courses, computer-aided design, which covered the Kunz patch, the method I described earlier for interpolating doubly curved surfaces along line segments. At the time, Kunz was co-directing with Douglas Ross the CAT project and had already advised Ivan Sutherland in his development of Sketchpad. After these courses, Kunz became a co-advisor for Negroponte's thesis, a piece of architectural research exploring computers as machines for simulating perception. After graduating, and after a very brief stint at IBM, Negroponte accepted Kunz's invitation to teach his analytical geometry course in the mechanical engineering department in 1966 and 67, that academic year. Soon after, he was hired by Lawrence Anderson for the architecture faculty. A lot of what Negroponte produced during these years was channeled through his research group called the Architecture Machine, was a research laboratory that he started with his professor, Leon Greuser. And it was really a platform to speculate about the role of computers in design and urban planning and architecture. In 1985, the architecture machine would morph, would mutate into the MIT Media Lab. The group's early projects and texts portrayed computers less as slaves and more as compliant partners, old friends, or as playful ethical robots that would enable individual users and communities to design their own environments. This portrait of computers as human-like agents of social and environmental change is discernible even in projects that predate the group's foundation, such as Urban 5 from 1968, where Negroponte explored natural language as a way of communicating with a piece of software around the development of urban and architectural plans. So a common theme of these early projects is the desire for creating ways of design that were more adaptable and more customized. This is the origin of the discourses of mass customization. But this was also a way of challenging the authority of architects and planners. It was a way of saying, well, maybe with computers we don't need to resort to architects, planners, and politicians to design our own environment. Maybe we can encode in these machines all the information users and dwellers need, and the machine would produce a neutral and scientifically accurate representation of design. So Urban 5 was an experiment on that line of thinking. It was a system. It comprised like a screen, a cathode ray tube monitor, a keyboard, and an optic pen, and users would use natural language to specify design constraints, for instance, number of rooms or other requirements regarding access, for instance, and the computer would try to compute a three-dimensional solution to that set of constraints. When the constraints were not, when the system was over-constrained, then something like this would happen. The idea was to create this sort of conversational agent, similar to what Liza, the early language processing software, tried to do a few years earlier. Obviously, Urban 5 did not fulfill Negroponte or anyone's expectations because of his inability to enact what they thought were the attributes of a truly adaptable architecture machine. As Negroponte wrote persuasively, the machine inexhaustibly printed garbage. Another project from this period is SIG, a machine that involves a family of gargoyles, a computer vision system, and a robotic arm that reconfigures these aluminum boxes according to what the machine thought the gargoyles were trying to do. So it was a very strange system. When I asked Negroponte about this project, he said, "This is probably the most stupid project we ever did." It's hard to disagree with that question, especially when you hear the stories about how dead gargoyles were starting to smell in the architectural machine laboratory. So, but these projects are all aligned with these ideas of emancipation, of democratization, the idea that the computer would enable a more objective, scientifically accurate design process. This idea, another idea that was very important was the idea of democracy or participation. And that is visible in another of the group's projects called the Hesdorfer experiment, which has 3 black men from Boston's quote-unquote ghetto area communicate with a computer in order to find about their urban needs. Notably, it was not really a computer. It was just a remotely operated typewriter and operated by one of the researchers in a nearby room. But despite that fact, the book celebrates, in Negroponte's book, it is celebrated that during the experiment, the subjects did not type uncalled for remarks, and argues that they engaged the machine in a way that wouldn't have taken place if the interlocutor was a white planner or politician, quote unquote. So there's obviously a problematic racial nomenclature here, but I would like to focus more on the sort of neutrality that that is attributed to the machine by the researchers. I think it's worthy of notice. In this experiment, the computer is imagined as a neutral device, a neutrality that helps, in fact, the researchers conceal their personas, the politics of the experimental setup, and quite specifically, their whiteness. By the mid-1970s, the group shifted focus. They were no longer so interested in urban and architectural design problems and leaned instead towards the exploration of new human-machine interfaces. These included gestural controls, speech recognition, pressure-sensitive displays, responsive spaces, and digital video as a random access medium. For example, the Aspen movie map of 1978 was based on laser discs, which were a new technology at the time, in order to create what we could call the first interactive mapping system. So as we can see, these projects help define a blueprint of a landscape of cultural practices that is still expanding today. The transformation of the group, of the architecture machine group, into the MIT Media Lab in '85 is an example or an evidence of this fact. Most crucially, we may recognize a connecting line between the first milling machine, the CAD project, the architecture machine, and the Media Lab, framed within a historical and cultural context of finding civilian uses to what until the 1940s was predominantly understood as a war machine. So the questions about computing and the debates about augmentation and automation between embodied interaction and symbolic manipulation illustrate the convergence of different and sometimes conflicting conceptions of creative work. We may see an expanded trajectory from mainframe to personal computing, outlining a profound cultural change where our personal identities are enmeshed with our personalized use of computing machines. In this trajectory, which today we have come to associate with the solitary work of Apple computers and Steve Jobs, we may consider another Steve, Kunz, as its earliest and most articulate advocate. It also shows that even impractical and failed technologies carry a blueprint of their makers' time, questions, and desires. While unsuccessful as planning tools, Urban 5 and the machine in the Hesdorfer experiment sought to reimagine design as a collaborative, participatory, and evolving dialogue between always adapting humans and machines. There is no doubt that these were provocative propositions. But they also show some pitfalls. As these researchers sought to humanize the computer, turning it into a perfect slave or compliant partner of design, their stories obfuscated their own ties to the machines and the many decisions that went into their design, implementation, and operation. Presenting the machine as a human has the effect of concealing the assumptions and interests that go into their very design. Further, the aspirations of democratization through technology, so key to ArcMac, and to more recent stories such as those connected to the maker movement or to 3D printing, etc., they also describe what we may call the paradox of participation, the idea that only through certain technologies we are able to participate, casting problematically political agency as a technologically mediated process. Here, what is presented as a bottom-up process is in fact a quintessentially top-down operation. The deployment of technology, which in the case of the one laptop per child, proposed to literally throw computers from a helicopter. Most crucially, perhaps the most important idea I have tried to outline today is that, well, most design and technology discourses are premised on the idea of reducing the time and the skills that we need to design and manufacture. This time and these skills, this work does not really disappear. As the early histories of numerical control and computer-aided design show, this work is in fact recomposed and transferred to an infrastructural economy of technology design, production, maintenance, and operation that for too long has remained outside the focus of architectural and design scholarship. For researchers and scholars trying to carry these legacies, these aspirations, and I include myself, a key question is how to approach technological systems in a way that is critically astute, but that also acknowledges the aesthetic, imaginative, and speculative capacities enabled by these infrastructures. This is for sure an open question, but I believe that reflecting on these histories may be useful. To finalize, I will share a few thoughts. They are somewhere between points for conversation, working hypotheses, or field notes. One is we should demystify technology and challenge its dominant image as an inevitable and autonomous force. Second, we should see computing practices as indigenous. Computation is in fact a rich tapestry of crafts that is local to the cultural politics of the Cold War and the Anglo-Saxon university, and to a contemporary globalist mindset. Again, not a tool, but an infrastructure, a connective tissue encompassing key cultural and material aspects of contemporary creative practice. To accomplish this, we must create new critical and speculative tools and vocabularies to make visible and engage critically these socio-technical systems. We must develop new methods for data collection and visualization, allowing us to probe the ephemeral and the contingent aspects of design production and to see them from new perspectives. We must reveal software histories, the ecologies of design production, developing around large and interdisciplinary projects, the alignments of government, academia, and industry along nation-building endeavors, the popular imagination of technology and design, and recognize both the poetics and the politics in the work of technologists and engineers. And the prospect, I think, that interests me the most here is to explore alignments across the disciplines of architecture, media, and science and technology studies, along the critical investigation of the socio-technical infrastructures shaping our artificial environments. The challenge is not to see this as a dilution of our disciplines, but as a recognition that cultural production today, and this includes cities, buildings, interfaces, as well as works of art, is only possible by the alignments or misalignments of complex ecologies involving humans, software, professions, materials, skills, and machines, and that this demands an expanded perspective, both in creative practice and scholarly analysis. I'll be really happy to engage with questions. Yeah.